As I said earlier, we're talking about the idea of hell, and the title I gave today was a compassionate view of hell. And you may well wonder, is a compassionate or merciful view of hell even possible? When we talk about this idea, and it's true of many ideas that we find within the Word, we have to understand the concept of appearances. Now, you might say, oh, David, this is an idea you're making up just to kind of say really whatever you would like to say from the Bible. That's one of the things that's often said. Well, that's not the case. We are familiar with the idea of appearances, and we are familiar with it from a scientific point of view as well. So, for example, think about your own body. My body looks solid. It feels solid. But if you think about your body, or a chair or a table, at an atomic level, a scientist will tell you there's actually more space there than there is actually mass. Our body is made up of a great deal of space. But the appearance is that it's solid. This is what Swedenborg is talking about when he speaks of appearances. There is one way that things look, but then if you go deep enough, there's another reality entirely. And this is true of many ideas in the Bible, like the idea of hell. Can I ask you, how do you think the world is going right now? Are we doing a good job? Is it successful? Are we managing to live a good life? You see, we look around the world and we look particularly at the news, and every day the news serves you up stories of war, of murder, of violence of one kind or another, even violence within the family, within the home, where we expect sanctuary and safety. We hear again and again, particularly women who are injured or even murdered by those whom they love. We hear stories of theft and fraud. So how well are we doing, really? Now, in this world where we see these problems which are rife, how do we address this problem in the world? What do we do? Well, we do a couple of things. We take those who commit these evils and we set them aside. We separate them out. We put them in prison. We remove them from society. That's one thing we do. And then we have some form of punishment or deterrent often. So we think of, well, the incarceration itself is a form of punishment. You have committed an evil, you have broken the law, so we will separate you from society. We will not allow you to interact with other good people. But we also have often financial punishments. We take away the proceeds of crime, or we make people pay for the damage that they have done. Now, what is it that we are trying to achieve by doing those things? Why do we put criminals in prison? Well, what we're trying to do is to preserve and protect those who are good. Now, my next question is, does that work? Well, I'm going to suggest that no, it doesn't. So our justice system works in such a way that it can only act after a crime has taken place. So our justice system is kind of always playing a catch-up game with crime. It is repairing the damage which has already been done. But of course, there's a limit on how much repair you can do. So, for example, if someone has been murdered, you cannot bring them back from the grave. That is something that is not repairable. There is always a victim if there is a crime. Justice in itself has a basic limitation to it. We can't prevent crimes from taking place without restricting everybody's freedoms. And we can't even prevent crimes from happening again. So often we hear the story of someone who is sent to prison, they'll spend their time there for a couple of years and they come back out into society, and what happens? Are they reformed? Not necessarily. Very often they repeat other crimes or even the same crimes, and they get sent back into jail again. It becomes this cyclic process. We cannot convert or reform a criminal who does not wish to be converted or reformed. And one of the problems we face in our world today is that we can only see the external part of a person. I relate to you on the basis of what I see. I relate to you on the basis of how I see you behave. And the justice system must be the same. That's all we've got to go on. Only the external aspect of a person. However, when we look at the spiritual world, we have a fundamental change that takes place. There, in the spiritual world, we see the whole person. External, the external actions, but also the internal, reflected fully and accurately in those externals. So, when Swedenborg describes entering the spiritual world after death, he talks about the way we do so with our mask intact at first. So when we first enter the spiritual world, we look and we feel and we act in much the same way as we do in the natural world. But gradually, with process of time, that mask falls away. We're unable to hang on to those appearances. Our inner self bursts out, and it keeps doing so until finally there is no mask at all. And everything about our internal nature is displayed for all to see, including ourselves. Now, as that occurs, what happens is we begin to gravitate towards certain people who share our inner nature. We already sense this in the natural world in some way. There are certain people we gravitate towards. They reflect something about us that we find attractive and enjoyable. It happens so much more powerfully in the spiritual world. Birds of a feather flock together. And this is the process of judgment. It is the dropping of the mask, the exposing of the true whole, internal and external person, and then this gravitation towards those of like nature. And in that process of gravitation towards those of like nature, we have a separation which also takes place quite naturally. No one is forcing this to take place. No one is sending you to that place if you behave this way and that place if you behave that. That separation just happens. But it's also a necessary one. Why is it necessary? Because that separation into the good and the evil is what protects the good. You see, in our world where we are all mixed up together, who is it that suffers? Is it the evil or is it the good? Well, it's the good who suffer. So the separation must take place to preserve that good. Now, I just want to jump back into the parables that we read from Matthew's Gospel. The servants of the master, they notice the tares in the field, and they go to the master and say, well, should we remove the tares? Why not root out that evil early? Why not get rid of it sooner? Well, the thing is that it needs to be made manifest. It needs to show its true nature for us to truly determine whether it is good or evil. We must see its full nature on display, because we can make some terrible, terrible mistakes if we do not. And again, the justice system in our world makes these mistakes again and again. Now, Jesus talks on a global scale. So when he talks to the disciples about the interpretation of the parable, he says that, the seeds are the sons of the kingdom, and the tare seeds are the sons of the wicked one. And that's kind of a global level. He's talking about individuals as they were, all mixed up in the world as we are. But it's also true of us internally on a microcosm level, if we think about ourselves, that we are made up of the sons of the kingdom and the sons of the wicked one. We have these various seeds within our lives. And as we are regenerated, what happens is the tares mature and we see their nature and we are able to root them out, one at a time often. So what is true on the macrocosm of the world is also true of us as a microcosm. And then he talks about the burning. Did you hear that? You know, the tares will be bound up to be burned. And this idea of hellfire. Well, fire represents loves and delights. And love can be positive and it can be negative. So fire was certainly used in the temple as part of the temple ritual, but fire also has its negative connotations. And it's delight. It's what I enjoy. This is the fire. This is what drives me. This is what makes me warm, is that delight. And hellfire really is not difficult to imagine. Think about a band of thieves and the way that they interact with one another. Going about the business of thieving and robbing from others, then they get on quite well with one another because they're cooperating to obtain what belongs to somebody else. But once they have that thing and they start bickering amongst themselves over who should get the greater share, then just watch what happens. And watch the way that fire, that delight, turns in against one another. So I want to just come back to the Lord, because when Swedenborg talks about any concept, he begins with the Lord, who is love. So he says, the Lord does not restrict the entrance to heaven. The Lord prevents no one from entering heaven. Anybody who wishes to can go there. He does not send anyone to hell. In fact, he seeks to raise everybody to heaven, and at the very least, if he cannot do that, he seeks to prevent them descending into a lower hell. And he also says that no one is born for hell. No one is even born with a spiritual disadvantage. You know, in our world, we are born advantaged, you know, with a silver spoon in your mouth, or disadvantaged in the poorest of the poor. But on a spiritual level, we all are on an even playing field. Let me just read something from Swedenborg. Divine providence is a predestination only to heaven. Everyone is created to go to heaven. This is the ultimate goal of creation. The reason not everyone gets to heaven, though, is that people immerse themselves in pleasures of hell that are contrary to the blessedness of heaven. People who do not enjoy heaven's bliss cannot enter heaven because they cannot stand the place. It's quite a different view, isn't it? Now, when we talk about punishment and the suffering of the evil, there's a couple of things to bear in mind. Swedenborg says things like that good contains its own reward and evil contains its own punishment. Again, there is a natural process that goes on when you do certain things. Swedenborg does talk about the suffering of evil spirits. However, the suffering he describes is when they try to enter heaven. After death, no one is prevented from coming up into heaven. We are shown the way and given the resources, and we are let in. However, if we enjoy evil, when we get to heaven and breathe in its pleasure, we begin to have such chest pains, heart pangs, and dizziness that we writhe like a snake next to a fire. Then, with faces turned away from heaven and towards hell, we run away headlong, finding no rest until we are in the community of our own love. It's only when we've separated into our group, our community that feels like home, that we feel at peace, if there is any peace to be found. So hell is no more than the consequence of a life which is focused on selfishness and external worldly concerns. And the choice is ours. And when we talk about this idea of separation and punishment, they are both inherent properties of the delight that we have ourselves. So evil carries its own punishment, and it also draws us towards those who delight in those same evils. So when we talk about hell, there really is only one question to ask. What is heaven for you? Where do you find your greatest delight? Because that, whatever it is what defines heaven or hell for you.